Welcome back, everyone, to Mr. Cursed. Today, I'm sharing 7 really scary stories about being home alone in the Blue Ridge Mountains. These are true horror stories from the Appalachian hills that will give you chills. But before we start, please hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to like this video and share it with your friends. I'd also love to know where you're watching from. Just leave a comment below. Thanks so much for watching my channel. It really helps me out. Now, let's get into these scary stories. I work as a forensic anthropologist, and back when I was 35, the government sent me to investigate some missing hikers in the Blue Ridge Mountains. This was 2014, and I'd been consulting for them for about 3 years by then. My job was pretty straightforward. Analyze human remains, figure out what happened to people who disappeared. I'd worked plenty of violent crime scenes, seen what people could do to each other. So I figured this would be another case of someone getting lost, or maybe running into the wrong person on a trail. I rented this old hunting cabin from the 1950s that sat right in the middle of where all these disappearances happened. The plan was to spend a month there, use it as my base camp to check out all the sites where people went missing. The whole thing started because 15 people had vanished in that area over 5 years, and they all had similar circumstances. Experienced hikers, good weather, well-marked trails, but they just disappeared without a trace. No bodies, no gear left behind, nothing. The local sheriff's department was stumped, so they called in the feds, and the feds called me. I brought all my equipment, forensic tools, laptops, detailed maps of the area, case files on every missing person. I'm not someone who scares easily. I've spent my career around death, examining bones, figuring out how people died. I approach everything methodically, scientifically. That's what I thought this would be, just another puzzle to solve. The cabin was pretty basic but had everything I needed. Good cell service, reliable power, running water. It was isolated enough that I could work without distractions, but close enough to all the disappearance sites that I could hike to them easily. The first few days, I just studied the case files and planned my route. I noticed all the missing people had disappeared within about a 10-mile radius of the cabin, mostly on the eastern slopes where the old growth forest was thickest. That seemed like the logical place to start looking. On my 4th day there, I found the first bones. I was about 2 miles up the main trail when I saw them arranged in this perfect geometric pattern on a flat rock outcropping. At first I thought maybe it was some kind of art installation or memorial, but when I got closer, I realized what I was looking at. Human finger bones, arranged in concentric circles with mathematical precision. Not scattered by animals or weather, deliberately placed. Each bone was clean, completely free of tissue, but they weren't bleached white like you'd expect from exposure. They had this weird, almost polished look to them. I documented everything, took photos, collected samples. The forensic analysis I ran back at the cabin that night confirmed what I already suspected. Definitely human, definitely arranged by someone with knowledge of bone structure. But the carbon dating results didn't make sense. Some of those bones were decades old, others just a few years. A few tested even older than that, maybe a century or more. Someone had been collecting human remains in these mountains for a very long time. Over the next week, I found more sites. Always the same pattern, bones arranged in geometric designs, always in locations that overlooked the main hiking trails. I started mapping them out, and I realized they formed a rough territorial boundary covering the entire mountain range where people had gone missing. The arrangements weren't random either. They showed an understanding of anatomy that most people don't have, and an artistic sensibility that suggested ritual or ceremonial purpose. The tool marks on the bones were what really got my attention, though. Someone had carefully removed these bones from bodies using implements that weren't metal, maybe bone, tools, or very old stone implements. The cuts were precise, deliberate, made by someone who understood human anatomy better than most doctors. This wasn't the work of some crazy person, randomly killing hikers. This was systematic, methodical, going back generations. I started researching the history of the area and found references to something the Cherokee called bone dancers, tall, thin figures that moved through the mountains at night, collecting pieces of the dead for their ceremonies. Most anthropologists dismissed it as folklore, but looking at my evidence, I wasn't so sure anymore. That's when I first saw it. I was documenting another bone site, about a mile deeper into the forest than I'd been before, when I caught movement in my peripheral vision. At first I thought it was a person, tall, maybe 8 feet, moving between the trees about 50 yards away. But something was wrong with the proportions. Too thin, arms too long, head the wrong shape. I grabbed my camera and managed to get a few shots before it disappeared back into the forest. When I reviewed the photos that night, I realized I was looking at something that shouldn't exist. The figure was definitely bipedal, definitely intelligent based on how it moved, but it wasn't human. The limbs were elongated, the torso stretched, and what I could see of the head looked more like a skull than a face. It was carrying something, tools maybe, or bones. That night, lying in the cabin, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. As a scientist, I knew I needed more evidence, more observation, better documentation. But some part of me, the part that keeps people alive, was telling me to pack up and leave. I chose science over survival instincts. And honestly, looking back now, that was probably the dumbest decision I've ever made. I spent the next several days tracking it, documenting its behavior from a distance. It was intelligent, no doubt about that. It used tools, showed clear artistic ability, and had established territorial boundaries throughout the mountains, the bone arrangements. It weren't just collections, they were markers, warnings, maybe even some kind of ceremonial art. This thing had been living in these mountains for decades, maybe centuries, systematically harvesting parts from anyone who wandered into its territory. The more I watched it, the more I realized it was studying me too. I started noticing small things at first. My equipment moved slightly when I wasn't looking. Tools arranged differently than I'd left them. Food supplies reorganized. It was subtle at first, but it got more obvious as the days went on. The thing was coming into the cabin at night while I slept, examining my work, learning about me the same way I was learning about it. One morning I woke up to find my forensic tools laid out in the same geometric patterns I'd been finding the bones arranged in. It had been studying my methods, learning how I analyzed remains, understanding my work. That's when I realized I wasn't the hunter in this situation anymore. I was the prey. The thing started getting bolder. I'd catch glimpses of it during the day, always watching from just inside the tree line. At night, I could hear it moving around the cabin, testing windows and doors. I reinforced the locks, but honestly, looking at the size and apparent strength of this thing, I knew the cabin wouldn't keep it out if it really wanted to get inside. But it wasn't trying to break in. It was evaluating me, the same way I'd been evaluating the bone sites. I started to understand that to this creature, I represented something special. An educated human with knowledge of bones and anatomy. My skills made me a particularly valuable addition to its collection. The realization that motivated me to finish my documentation as quickly as possible was that I might not make it out of these mountains alive. But the evidence I'd gathered was too important to lose. This thing had been killing people for generations, and if I could prove its existence, maybe I could save future lives. So I worked frantically to compile everything: photos, forensic analysis, geographic mapping, behavioral observations. On my last night in the cabin, it finally made its move. I was uploading my final reports to my colleagues when I heard scratching at the back door. Not random animal scratching, deliberate, methodical, like someone tracing patterns in the wood. I grabbed my flashlight and went to check the locks. Through the window, I could see it standing about 10 feet from the door, perfectly still, watching me. In the light, I could see it clearly for the first time. It looked like a human skeleton that had been stretched and twisted, covered in skin that looked more like leather than flesh. The skull was elongated, the eye sockets too deep, the jaw hinged wrong. Its arms reached almost to the ground, and its fingers ended in what looked like sharpened bone points. But the most unsettling thing was how it moved. Too fluid, like it had extra joints in places where humans don't have joints. It tilted its head at an impossible angle and made a sound I can't really describe. Not quite a voice, not quite an animal noise, but something that felt like words spoken by something that didn't understand how human speech was supposed to work. I backed away from the window, grabbed my laptop and car keys, and headed for the front door. My truck was parked about 20 yards away, and I figured if I could make it there, I could get back to town and return with help. But when I opened the front door, it was standing right there waiting for me. Up close, I could see that its bone tools weren't just tools. They were carved from human bones, probably taken from previous victims. It held them almost reverently, like they were sacred objects. It studied me for a long moment, then reached out one elongated finger and touched my forehead. Its skin felt like cold, dry leather, and I could smell something like old grave dirt and decaying leaves. I don't remember making the decision to run. One moment I was frozen in the doorway. The next I was sprinting past it toward my truck. I expected it to chase me, but it didn't. It just stood there watching, like it knew something I didn't. My truck started fine, and I drove out of there as fast as the mountain roads would allow. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway, and I didn't feel safe until I was back in town with streetlights and other people around. When I checked my phone, all my research had uploaded successfully. My colleagues had everything they needed to understand what was happening in those mountains. The area was declared off-limits to hikers 6 months later, after a joint investigation by several federal agencies confirmed my findings. Officially, they cited unstable geological conditions and dangerous wildlife as the reasons for closing the trails. But I know the real reason, and I know my research probably saved lives. I never went back to those mountains. I still do forensic work, but I don't take consulting jobs in remote areas anymore. I stick to urban crime scenes, places with plenty of people and good cell service. Sometimes at night, especially when the wind is blowing through the trees outside my house, I think I hear that scratching sound again. And sometimes I wonder if that thing is still out there, still collecting bones, still waiting patiently for someone new to wander into its territory. Looking back now, I realize I was never really investigating those disappearances. I was being evaluated as the next addition to an ancient collection. The only reason I'm still alive to tell this story is because I managed to complete my work and get out before it decided I was ready to be harvested. But I'll never forget the way it looked at me that last night, like it was memorizing every detail of my bones, planning exactly where each piece would fit in its next artistic arrangement. I'm 22 years old, and I guess I should start by saying I never thought I'd be the kind of person running away in the middle of the night with a bag full of stolen money. But when your boyfriend starts hitting you and threatening to do worse and you find $3,000 in cash stuffed in his sock drawer next to a bag of pills, well, sometimes you make choices you never thought you would. I took that money and ran. Didn't even pack much besides some clothes and my grandmother's old cabin key that I'd kept after she died 2 years back. The cabin was way up in the Virginia mountains, about 30 miles from the nearest town. Nobody had been up there since Grandma passed, and honestly, it was falling apart even when she was alive. But it was isolated, had 4 walls and a roof, and most importantly, it was somewhere Derek would never think to look for me. I figured I could hide out there for a few weeks, maybe a month, until I could figure out what to do next. The place didn't even have electricity anymore, but I had a flashlight and some candles, and there were still canned goods in the pantry from when Grandma lived there. I drove up there on a Tuesday night in October, my hands shaking so bad I could barely grip the steering wheel. Every pair of headlights in my rearview mirror made my heart jump. I kept expecting to see Derek's pickup truck coming after me, but I made it to the cabin without seeing another soul. The place looked even worse than I remembered. Windows boarded up, porch sagging, roof missing shingles. But it was mine, at least for now. The first few days were rough. I'd brought some canned soup and crackers, and there was still an old manual can opener in one of the kitchen drawers. I slept on the couch with a kitchen knife next to me, jumping at every little sound the old house made. But after 3 days of nothing but silence and mountain air, and I started to relax a little, maybe I'd actually gotten away clean. That's when I started noticing things weren't quite right. The 4th night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to this sound outside, like something big walking around the cabin. Not like a deer or even a bear, but something that moved with purpose. I held my breath and listened, but after maybe 10 minutes it stopped. I told myself it was probably just an animal checking out the place, maybe curious about the human smell after the cabin being empty for so long. The next morning, I found scratches on the outside walls. Deep ones, way too high up to be from any normal animal. They looked fresh, like someone had dragged their fingernails down the wood, except these gouges were thick as my thumb. I walked around the whole cabin, and there were marks on all four sides, like something had been marking its territory. That afternoon, I found the first deer carcass about 50 yards from the back porch. It had been torn apart, not cleanly killed like you'd see from a hunter, but ripped to pieces like something had just pulled it apart with its bare hands. The smell was awful, but what really bothered me was how it looked like whatever killed it had only eaten parts of it and left the rest to rot. I started finding footprints in the mud around the property. Big ones, bigger than any human foot I'd ever seen. Maybe 8 or 9 inches long, and the stride was huge, like whatever made them was tall, really tall. They seemed to circle the cabin at different times, and I realized whatever was making them had been watching me, learning when I went outside, when I stayed in, what I did each day. The thing was smart. That's what scared me the most. It wasn't just some dumb animal wandering through. It was studying me. By the end of the first week, I found that trees had been dragged across the logging road that led back to 2 Main Highway. Not fallen trees, dragged trees with the bark scraped off where they'd been pulled into position. Someone or something had blocked my way out, and I was starting to think it wasn't an accident. The smell got worse too. This thick, musky odor that seemed to hang in the air around the cabin, especially at night. It reminded me of a zoo, but stronger, more intense, like wet dog mixed with something rotten, and it was getting stronger every day. Then the noises started getting more deliberate. Not just walking around the cabin, but tapping on the walls, scratching at the boarded-up windows, making sounds like it was testing the strength of everything. Sometimes I'd hear it on the roof, heavy footsteps right above where I was sitting, like it was mapping out the whole place from above. One night I heard it calling my name, not like a person would call out, but in different voices, like it had heard other people say my name and was trying to copy them. Some of the voices sounded terrified, like people screaming for help. That's when I realized this thing had done this before, to other people, and it had been listening when they called out for Jessica to help them. I found bones the next morning, human bones arranged in a neat little pile on the front porch. Some of them looked old, yellowed with age, but others still had bits of flesh hanging off them. Fresh ones, and there were personal belongings mixed in. A watch, some keys, a wallet with someone's driver's license from 1998. That's when I knew I had to get out of there, blocked road or not. But when I went to start my car, nothing happened. The engine wouldn't even turn over. And when I popped the hood, I saw that something had torn out chunks of the wiring. Not cut cleanly with tools, but ripped apart like someone had grabbed handfuls of cables and yanked them out with their bare hands. I was trapped. The attacks started that night. Something huge slammed into the side of the cabin, hard enough to shake the whole structure. Then another impact, and another, like it was testing how much force the walls could take. I grabbed my knife and huddled in the corner of the living room, listening to this thing systematically working its way around the building, hitting different spots, pushing on the boarded windows, trying to find a weak point. Around 4 a.m., it found one. The back door just exploded inward, the whole frame splintering like it was made of toothpicks. I saw it then, standing in the doorway, and I finally understood what I was dealing with. It was maybe 9 feet tall, covered in dark hair, with arms that hung down past its knees. But it moved like a person, not like an animal. It tilted its head when it saw me, studying me like I was something interesting it had found. I ran. There was a door to the basement, and I made it down the stairs just as the thing came after me. But when I got to the bottom, I realized I'd made a terrible mistake. The basement wasn't empty. There were more bones down there, lots of them, scattered around like decorations, and the walls were covered in scratch marks like people had tried to claw their way out. This wasn't just some random attack. This was where it brought people to feed. I could hear it coming down the stairs, taking its time now that it knew I was cornered. The steps creaked under its weight, and I could smell that awful, musky odor getting stronger. I pressed myself against the back wall and tried to think of something, anything I could do. There was an old fruit jar on one of the shelves, and when the thing finally came into view at the bottom of the stairs, I smashed it against the wall and grabbed a piece of broken glass. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. The creature moved toward me slowly, like it was savoring the moment. That's when I noticed there was a loose stone in the foundation behind me, just big enough for a person to squeeze through if they were desperate enough. While the thing was focused on me, I started working at the stone with my free hand. When it lunged, I slashed at its face with the glass, aiming for the eyes. It worked. The thing let out this horrible roar and stumbled backward, clawing at its face. That gave me just enough time to pull the stone free and squeeze through the hole in the foundation. I came out under the cabin and could hear the thing tearing the basement apart in its rage. I crawled out from under the porch and ran for the woods, not caring about the branches tearing at my clothes or the rocks cutting my feet through my shoes. But the thing was fast. Way faster than anything that size should have been. I could hear it crashing through the trees behind me, gaining ground with every step. I ran for hours, or at least it felt like hours, my lungs burning and my legs cramping, but I could still hear it back there, following me. I finally reached the edge of a cliff, maybe 200 feet down to a creek below. I could hear the thing getting closer, could smell that awful odor on the wind. I had maybe 30 seconds before it reached me, and I had two choices: let it catch me or jump. I jumped. I hit some tree branches on the way down, which probably saved my life by breaking my fall, but I still landed hard in the creek and felt something snap in my left arm. I think I blacked out for a few minutes because the next thing I remember was lying in the water with my arm bent at a weird angle and blood running down my face. But I was alive, and when I looked up at the cliff, the thing was gone. I crawled downstream for what felt like miles before I finally made it to a road where someone found me and called an ambulance. I told the police I'd fallen while hiking, and they believed me because I was so messed up. Broken arm, 3 cracked ribs, concussion, and cuts all over from the tree branches. That was 6 months ago. I never went back for my car or my stuff, and I never told anyone what really happened up there. My arm still doesn't work right, and I can't sleep in a room without at least 3 locks in the door. I moved to a city, 3rd-floor apartment. Lots of neighbors around all the time. But sometimes, late at night when it's really quiet, I swear I can still smell that musky odor. And I know that thing is still out there in those mountains, waiting for the next person who thinks they can hide in the woods where nobody will find them. I was wrong about that. Something will always find you up there. Something hungry. I guess it started the year I turned 19, and everything in my life went completely sideways. My name's Tyler, and back then I was living in Charlotte, working nights at a gas station to pay for community college. I thought I had things figured out, you know. Keep my head down, save up money, maybe transfer to a 4-year school eventually. But then I saw something I wasn't supposed to see, and suddenly I was running for my life through the North Carolina mountains with nothing but a backpack and about $300 in cash. It happened on a Tuesday night in October. I was closing up the station when these 3 guys pulled up in a black SUV. They looked like customers at first, but then I noticed one of them was wearing a police uniform. They went around back where we kept the dumpster, and I heard voices getting loud, then a gunshot. When I looked out the back window, I saw the cop standing over someone while the other 2 were going through the dead guy's pockets. The worst part was I recognized the cop, Officer Martinez, who came in for coffee every morning and always acted like he was one of the good ones. They must have seen me at the window because suddenly they were all looking right at me. I ran. Didn't even grab the till money or turn off the lights. Just bolted out the front door and kept running until I got to my beat-up Honda in the employee parking area. I could hear them shouting behind me, car doors slamming, but I was already peeling out onto the main road. I couldn't go home. They knew where I worked, so they'd figure out where I lived pretty quick. I couldn't go to the police because one of them was the police, and I had no idea how deep the corruption went. I couldn't even call my family because what if they were watching them too? So I just drove north into the mountains, taking back roads and using cash for gas, trying to put as much distance as possible between me and Charlotte. After driving for about 6 hours, I found this old logging road that looked like it hadn't been used in years. I followed it up into the hills until I came across this abandoned cabin sitting by itself in a little clearing. The place was falling apart. Half the roof was missing, windows were broken, and there were weeds growing up through the porch floorboards. But it had 4 walls and no neighbors for miles, which was exactly what I needed. I parked my car behind some trees where it couldn't be seen from the road and hiked up to check out the cabin. The door was hanging off its hinges, and the inside smelled like mold and rotting wood, but it was dry enough. There was even an old wood stove that might work if I could find some dry fuel. I figured I could lay low there for a few days while I tried to figure out what to do next. Looking back now, I wish I'd just kept driving. Found a motel in another state, called the FBI. Anything but staying in that place. Because that cabin wasn't as empty as I thought it was. The first night was quiet. I slept in my car with the doors locked, just to be safe, and nothing happened. But the second night, after I'd moved some of my stuff into the cabin, I started hearing things. Footsteps on the roof, like someone was walking around up there. But when I went outside with my flashlight, there wasn't anyone. Just broken shingles and bird droppings. I told myself it was probably just raccoons or possums. Mountain cabins always had animals living in them, right? But the footsteps sounded too heavy, too deliberate, and they always seemed to stop the moment I tried to investigate. The third day, I found the first skin. I was exploring the cabin trying to see if there was anything useful left behind when I opened this old wardrobe in what used to be the bedroom. Inside, hanging from a wooden PG like a coat, was what looked like a human hide, but not like, a Native American ceremonial thing or something historical. This looked fresh. The edges were still pink and raw, and it smelled like copper and meat. I slammed the wardrobe shut and backed away so fast I tripped over my own feet. My first thought was that I was losing my mind from stress and paranoia. Maybe I was hallucinating from not eating enough or sleeping poorly. I'd been living on gas station snacks and energy drinks for 3 days, after all. But when I opened the wardrobe again, it was still there. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every little sound made me jump. Branches creaking in the wind, mice scratching in the walls, the wood stove settling as it cooled down. And I kept thinking I heard footsteps again, but now they sounded like they were coming from inside the cabin instead of on the roof. The next morning I went to check the wardrobe again, and the skin was gone. Just an empty wooden peg and the smell of old mothballs. That's when I started wondering if someone was messing with me. Maybe whoever had been using this cabin before was still around trying to scare me off. It made sense. If you were squatting somewhere and some stranger showed up, you might try to spook them away instead of confronting them directly. But then I started finding evidence that someone else was there. My backpack would be moved slightly from where I left it. Cans of food would be rearranged in different orders. Once I found muddy footprints on the floor that definitely weren't mine. They were bigger, with an odd shape like the person was wearing shoes that didn't fit right. The really weird part was that the footprints seemed to be studying my stuff. They'd go from my sleeping bag to my backpack to the pile of clothes I'd left on a chair, like someone was walking around cataloging everything I owned. And they always led to the wardrobe and then stopped, like whoever was making them just vanished. I started getting paranoid that the cops from Charlotte had tracked me down, who had been watching the cabin, waiting for me to let my guard down. The footprints, the moved items, even the skin thing. Maybe it was all psychological warfare trying to make me crack so I'd run out into the open where they could grab me. That's when things started getting really strange. I'd see glimpses of someone outside the windows, but when I looked directly, there'd be nothing there. I'd hear my name being called from the woods in voices that sounded like my mom, my sister, even my ex-girlfriend Sarah. But I knew they didn't know where I was, and their voices sounded wrong somehow, like someone was doing impressions but getting the tone slightly off. The worst was when I started seeing myself. I was getting water from the old well behind the cabin when I looked up and saw someone standing at the tree line. For just a split second, I thought it was my reflection in a window or something, but there wasn't any glass, and the person was wearing my clothes. my exact clothes. Even had my haircut and the same scar on their chin from when I fell off my bike as a kid. The not me just stood there watching me for maybe 10 seconds, then turned and walked back into the woods. It moved like me too, with that little limp I have in my left leg from where I broke it in high school. That night I heard my own voice calling to me from outside. "Tyler," it said in my exact accent and inflection. "Tyler, come out here. I need to show you something." It sounded so much like me that for a minute I wondered if I was talking in my sleep or something. But I was wide awake sitting by the wood stove, and the voice was definitely coming from outside the cabin. "Tyler, I know you can hear me. Come outside." I grabbed my flashlight and went to the window, but I couldn't see anything in the darkness. The voice kept calling, though, getting more insistent. And the weird thing was, it wasn't just using my voice. It was using the way I talked when I was scared or confused, like it had been listening to me long enough to pick up on my emotional patterns. "Please, Tyler, I'm scared. I don't know what's happening to me." That's when I realized something was very, very wrong, because I had been saying those exact words to myself earlier that day. I'd been sitting in the cabin, scared and alone, and I'd said those words out loud. Whatever was outside had been listening to me, learning how I sounded when I was vulnerable. I didn't go outside. I pushed furniture against the door and stayed awake until sunrise, listening to my own voice begging me to come out and help. Sometimes it would cry like I do when I'm really upset, with these little gasping sobs that I thought nobody had ever heard before. But something had been listening. Something had been watching me close enough to know exactly how I sounded when I was breaking down. The next few days are kind of a blur. I stopped trusting anything I saw or heard. I'd find more skins in the wardrobe, sometimes human, sometimes animal, but always fresh and always arranged differently. I'd see people I knew from home standing in the woods, waving at me to come outside. My mom, my sister, even Officer Martinez with his fake friendly smile. But they'd always be wearing something wrong. My mom would be in a dress she didn't own, or my sister would have the wrong color hair. Little details that were almost right but not quite, like someone was working from descriptions instead of actually knowing these people. The thing that finally broke me was when I woke up one morning and saw myself sleeping in the corner of the cabin. I was lying on my sleeping bag by the wood stove, but there was another me curled up in the far corner, breathing slowly like it was asleep. It was wearing my clothes, had my face, even had the little mole on my neck that I've always been self-conscious about. But when I got closer, I could see that the skin didn't fit quite right. It was loose in some places, tight in others, like a suit that was the wrong size. I must have made a sound because the other me opened its eyes and looked right at me and smiled. "Good morning, Tyler," it said in my voice. "I was wondering when you'd wake up." I ran, didn't pack anything, didn't think about where I was going. Just bolted out of that cabin and into the woods, crashing through branches and stumbling over roots. I could hear it behind me, laughing in my own voice and calling out things I'd said to myself when I thought I was alone. "Come back, Tyler. We were just getting to know each other. Don't you want to see what other faces I can wear?" I kept running until I found the old logging road, then followed it back to where I'd hidden my car. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition, but eventually I got the engine started and drove away from that place as fast as the beat-up Honda would go. I didn't stop driving until I reached Virginia, found a rest stop with Wi-Fi, and called the FBI tip line to report what I'd seen in Charlotte. Turns out Officer Martinez had been under investigation for months, and my testimony was enough to help them build a case. They put me in protective custody until the trial, and eventually Martinez and his buddies got sent to prison. But I never told anyone about what happened in that cabin. Who would believe me? Even now, 5 years later, I'm not entirely sure I believe it myself. Maybe I had some kind of psychological break from the stress and trauma. Maybe I was hallucinating from fear and exhaustion. Maybe that whole week was just my mind trying to cope with seeing someone murdered right in front of me. The thing is, though, I still have dreams about it. Dreams where I'm back in that cabin, and there are dozens of skins hanging in that wardrobe. Different faces, different bodies, all arranged like costumes waiting to be worn. And in the Dryad, Ms., the thing wearing my face, is still there, still smiling, still asking me to come closer so it can show me all the people it's learned to be. I work in an office building now, in downtown. I'm 62 years old, and I never thought I'd be the kind of man who'd run from anything. 3 tours in Vietnam, 37 years of marriage to the same woman, and I'd seen enough to think I understood what fear was. But I was wrong about that. Dead wrong. My nephew Kevin had been deployed to Afghanistan for 8 months, and he'd asked me to keep an eye on his place up in the mountains near Beckley, West Virginia. It was a good arrangement for both of us. He needed someone to maintain the property, and I needed somewhere quiet to figure out how to live without Sarah. She'd lost her fight with cancer 6 months earlier, and the silence in our house had become unbearable. The cabin Kevin inherited from his grandfather was built back in the 80s, sitting about 40 feet over an old coal mine shaft that had been sealed decades ago. The foundation had been giving him problems: hairline cracks in the concrete, doors that wouldn't hang straight, that sort of thing. But the place was solid enough, and it gave me something to do with my hands while I worked through my grief. Kevin had left me with a list of maintenance tasks, his grandfather's tools, and a hunting rifle he kept for the occasional black bear. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles down a winding dirt road, which suited me fine. I'd spent enough time around people offering condolences and casseroles. What I needed was space to think. The first few weeks were exactly what I'd hoped for. I'd wake up early, make coffee the way Sarah taught me, and spend the day fixing things. Loose boards on the deck, a leaky faucet in the kitchen, reorganizing Kevin's grandfather's workshop in the basement. The physical work felt good, kept my mind occupied. In the evenings, I'd sit on the porch with a beer and listen to the forest settle in for the night. It was peaceful in a way I hadn't experienced since before Sarah got sick. Bhutan. Yet around the 3rd week, I started noticing things that didn't sit right with my military training. The sounds were wrong first. I'd spent enough time in jungles and mountains to know what normal forest noise should be. There should have been birds during the day, insects at night, the occasional rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. But some mornings the woods would go completely silent, like someone had thrown a switch. The air would feel thick, almost difficult to breathe, and there'd be this smell, not quite decay, but something organic and old. At first I figured it was just seasonal changes or maybe weather patterns I wasn't familiar with. But my instincts, the same ones that kept me alive in Southeast Asia, were telling me to pay attention. Then I started hearing movement underneath the cabin. The sealed mine shaft was directly below the living room, and sometimes at night I'd hear what sounded like scratching or scraping coming from down there. Kevin had mentioned that small animals sometimes got into the foundation through gaps in the stonework, so I didn't think much of it initially. But the sounds were too rhythmic, too purposeful. They'd start around midnight and continue for hours, like something was exploring the space below, testing the boundaries. I'd grab a flashlight and check the basement, but I never found anything. No droppings, no damage, no signs of animal activity. The really unsettling part was how the sounds would stop the moment I got close to investigating. Complete silence, like whatever was down there knew I was listening. That's when my military training started kicking in properly. In Vietnam, when the jungle went quiet, it meant you were being watched. When enemy movement stopped at your approach, it meant you were dealing with something intelligent. I began treating this situation like a potential threat assessment rather than a maintenance problem. I found the original mine survey maps in Kevin's grandfather's papers and studied the layout. The shaft went down about 60 feet before connecting to a network of tunnels that stretched for miles underground. Most of them had been sealed in the 1960s after a series of accidents, but the maps showed several access points scattered throughout the mountain. If something had found its way into that system, it would have plenty of room to move around undetected. The thought made me uncomfortable in a way I hadn't felt since my combat days. By the 4th week, the scratching had become more aggressive. Instead of the careful, exploratory sounds I'd been hearing, this was deliberate and forceful. Something was trying to dig through the concrete floor of the basement. I'd find fresh scratches in the foundation, deep gouges that looked like claw marks, but were too large to be from any animal I knew. When I measured them, they were nearly 4 inches long and spaced in patterns that suggested fingers rather than paws. That's when I started carrying Kevin's rifle with me, even just to check the mailbox. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday night during a thunderstorm. I was reading in the living room when I heard the concrete crack. Not a small sound. A sharp, gunshot-like crack that made the whole cabin shake. I grabbed my flashlight and the rifle and headed to the basement. There, in the center of the foundation floor, was a hole about the size of a dinner plate. The edges were rough, like something had punched through from below rather than being drilled from above. When I shined my light down into the opening, I could see it dropped straight down into the old mine shaft. But what made my blood run cold was the smell that came up from that hole. Something ancient and hungry, like meat that had been buried too long. I called Kevin on his satellite phone the next morning to ask about the mine's history. He told me his grandfather had mentioned strange occurrences over the years, tools going missing, sounds at night, the occasional hunter or hiker who'd disappear in the area. But his grandfather had always said the mine was properly sealed, that nothing could get in or out. When I described what I'd found, Kevin went quiet for a long moment. Then he told me something that made my combat instincts go into full alert mode. His grandfather had mentioned that whatever lived in those tunnels had been there longer than the mine, longer than the families who'd first settled the mountain. The miners had just disturbed something that should have been left alone. That night I set up a defensive position in the living room with clear sight lines to the basement door and all the windows. I'd done this sort of thing before, preparing for enemy contact in uncertain terrain. But this time felt different. In Vietnam, at least I'd known what I was fighting. Here, I was dealing with something that shouldn't exist, something that had been patient enough to spend weeks testing my defenses before making its move. When I heard the first footstep coming up from the basement, slow and deliberate on the wooden stairs, I knew my war was about to begin again. The basement door opened slowly, and I could hear breathing that sounded wrong. Too deep, too wet, like lungs that weren't built for air. I'd positioned myself behind the couch with the rifle ready, safety off, finger on the trigger. Whatever came through that door, I was going to be ready for it. But nothing could have prepared me for what I saw when it finally stepped into the living room light. It looked almost human at first glance, 2 arms, 2 legs, standing upright like a man. But the proportions were all wrong. The arms hung too long, reaching nearly to the floor. The fingers were extended and ended in what were definitely claws, not nails. The skin was pale and looked wet, like it had just crawled out of water, but the worst part was the face. It had features that resembled a human face, but stretched and distorted, like someone had taken a photograph and pulled it in different directions. The eyes were too large and completely black, and when it opened its mouth, I could see rows of teeth that belonged in a shark, not on land. I fired 3 rounds center mass, the way I'd been trained. The thing staggered backward, but didn't go down. Instead, it made a sound I'll never forget. Part scream, part roar, but with something almost like words mixed in. It was trying to speak, or maybe trying to copy human speech. That's when I realized this wasn't just some animal that had wandered up from the mine. This was something that had been watching people, learning from them, maybe for decades. The creature lunged at me with speed that didn't seem possible for something its size. I rolled behind the kitchen counter and fired twice more, catching it in the shoulder and spinning it around. But it recovered quickly and came after me again, those claws scraping grooves in the hardwood floor. I retreated to the bedroom, slamming the door behind me and bracing it with a dresser. Outside, I could hear it moving around the cabin, testing windows, trying the front door. It was intelligent enough to look for other ways in. I used the time to call 911, but the phone was dead. Cell service had always been spotty up here, but now I had no signal at all. My truck keys were in the kitchen, and I could hear the thing moving around out there, waiting. This wasn't random animal behavior. It was hunting, using tactics. It had cut off my communications and blocked my escape route. I'd seen enemy soldiers do the same thing in Vietnam, but never from something that shouldn't exist. For the next 3 hours, it played a waiting game with me. I could hear it moving around outside, sometimes scratching at the walls, sometimes making those awful sounds that were almost like speech. Occasionally, it would go quiet for long periods, and I'd think maybe it had given up and left. But then I'd hear a gentle tapping on the bedroom window, like someone pulled, lightly asking to come in. When I looked through the curtains, I could see its face pressed against the glass, those black eyes staring at me with an intelligence that made my skin crawl. Around 4 a.m., it tried a different approach. It started making sounds like Sarah's voice, calling my name from different parts of the cabin. "Frank? Frank, where are you? I'm cold, Frank. Help me." The voice was perfect, exactly like Sarah's, but I knew it was impossible. Sarah was gone. This thing had somehow learned her voice, maybe from listening to me talk to her photograph or hearing me cry her name during the nightmares. The fact that it would use my grief against me filled me with a rage I hadn't felt since combat. I made my decision then. I wasn't going to hide in this bedroom and let this thing torment me with my dead wife's voice. I was a combat veteran, and I'd faced worse odds than this. I had 5 rounds left in the rifle and Kevin's grandfather's hunting knife. If this thing wanted a fight, I'd give it one. I moved the dresser away from the door and stepped back into the main cabin. It was waiting for me in the living room, crouched near the hole it had made in the basement floor. When it saw me, it stood up to its full height, nearly 7 feet tall, and made that sound again, the one that was almost like speech. But this time I could swear I heard actual words mixed in. Hungry. So hungry. Long time hungry. It had been down in those tunnels for decades, maybe longer, surviving on whatever it could catch. And now it had found a source of food that could last it through another long winter. I put 2 rounds in its chest, and it staggered but kept coming. Another round to the head turned it sideways but didn't drop it. By then it was close enough that I could smell it, that ancient underground smell mixed with something else, something like old blood. I switched to the knife, Fee, and we went down together, rolling across the floor. Its claws raked across my ribs, opening cuts that burned like fire, but I managed to drive the blade deep into its throat. The sound it made when the knife went in wasn't animal or human, it was something else entirely, something that belonged in nightmares. Black blood poured from the wound, thicker than anything I'd ever seen, and the creature thrashed for what felt like minutes before finally going still. When it was over, I sat on the floor next to its body, bleeding and shaking, trying to process what had just happened. I knew no one would believe this story. A creature from an old mine shaft that could mimic human voices. It sounded insane even to me, and I'd lived through it. But I also knew I couldn't stay in that cabin, couldn't pretend this hadn't happened. I wrapped my wounds as best I could and dragged the creature's body back to the hole in the basement floor. It was heavier than it looked, and by the time I got it positioned over the opening, I was exhausted and losing blood. I pushed it through the hole and listened to it fall into the darkness below. Then I mixed up enough concrete to seal the opening permanently. It took me the rest of the day, working with tools from Kevin's grandfather's workshop, but I made sure nothing else would ever come up through that floor. When I was finished, I packed my things and drove down the mountain, leaving a note for Kevin explaining that the foundation problems were worse than we'd thought and the cabin wasn't safe to occupy. I never told Kevin the real story, and I never went back to that cabin. Kevin ended up selling the property to a development company after his grandfather's house was condemned due to foundation issues. Apparently, the damage was more extensive than anyone realized. The whole place was torn down 6 months later, and they filled in the mine shaft with concrete and gravel. I heard they built a shopping center there, but I've never driven by to see it. To this day, I don't know what that thing was or how long it had been living in those tunnels. I've done some research on the mining history of that area, and there are stories going back over 100 years about disappearances and strange encounters. Miners would report hearing voices calling to them from unexplored shafts or finding evidence of something living deep in the mountain. Most of those stories were dismissed as folklore or the result of gas exposure, but now I wonder. The cuts on my ribs healed clean, but they left scars that still ache when it rains. More than that, though, the encounter changed something fundamental about how I see the world. There are things living in the spaces between what we know and what we think is possible, things that are older and hungrier than we can imagine. Most of the time, we never cross paths with them, but sometimes, when we dig too deep or build in the wrong places, we disturbed something that should have been left alone. I still have nightmares about that voice, the way it copied Sarah so perfectly. Sometimes I wake up thinking I can hear her calling my name, and for just a moment, I'm back in that cabin, wondering if what I'm hearing is real or something pretending to be real. Those are the nights when I don't go back to sleep. I just sit in my chair and wait for morning, listening to the ordinary sounds of the world and reminding myself that some fights, once you win them, you never have to fight again. But you never really stop being ready for them either. Back when I was 28, I thought I had everything figured out. My name's Marcus, and I was working as an architect in Charlotte, pulling down good money, designing office buildings and shopping centers. The work was steady but soul-crushing, you know. All glass and steel, nothing with character. I'd been putting in 70-hour weeks for 3 years straight, and I was burned out. My cousin Danny had this modern cabin up in the North Carolina mountains near Blowing Rock, and he offered to let me use it for a month while he was traveling for work. Perfect timing. I had some vacation saved up, and I'd been sketching ideas for this revolutionary building design that could change everything. Something organic, something that worked with the land instead of against it. I packed up my drafting equipment, laptop, and enough supplies for a month, thinking this would be my chance to create something that mattered. The cabin was everything Danny had promised. 3 bedrooms, full kitchen, high-speed internet, and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the Blue Ridge Mountains. It sat on about 5 acres, completely private, with the nearest neighbor maybe 2 miles down a winding gravel road. The first day was perfect. I set up my drafting table by the big window, spread out my plans and sketches, and got more work done in 8 hours than I had in weeks back in Charlotte. The mountain air was crisp and clean, and I felt sharper than I had in years. That evening, I grilled a steak on the deck and watched the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. I remember thinking this was exactly what I needed: solitude, inspiration, and time to create something meaningful. I went to bed that night feeling more optimistic about my career than I had in ages. I'd mapped out the basic structure of my dream building, something that would blend into the landscape like it had grown there. And I was confident, maybe overconfident. I'd always been good at solving problems, handling stress, figuring things out. Growing up, I was the kid who took apart radios and put them back together, who built tree houses that actually stayed up. My professors in college called me a natural problem solver. I guess that confidence made me the perfect target. I woke up the second morning feeling groggy and disoriented. When I looked at the architectural plans spread across my table, they might as well have been written in a foreign language. Lines that had made perfect sense the day before looked like random scratches. I stared at my own handwriting in the margins, notes I'd written just 12 hours earlier, and couldn't understand what they meant. Load-bearing calculations I'd done 1,000 times looked completely alien. I figured I was just tired, maybe coming down with something. I made coffee and tried again, but it was like trying to read Sanskrit. By noon, I couldn't remember my middle name. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror saying, "Marcus, Marcus." And there should have been something else there, something that completed who I was. But it was gone. Just gone. I called my mom to ask, but her number went straight to voicemail, and when I tried to picture her face, it was like looking at static on an old TV. The harder I tried to remember, the more it slipped away. That afternoon, I looked in the mirror again and didn't recognize the person staring back. The eyes were mine, I thought, but the shape of the face seemed wrong somehow. Had my nose always been that long? Were my cheeks that hollow? I touched my reflection and felt like I was looking at a stranger wearing my skin. By evening, I couldn't remember my parents' faces at all. My childhood was just a blank space where memories should have been. And something was feeding. I could feel it attached to my mind like a parasite, drinking deeply from everything that made me who I was. But as my memories disappeared, new ones were flooding in, memories that didn't belong to me. I suddenly knew how to speak fluent German, even though I'd never studied it. I had vivid recollections of working in a coal mine in West Virginia, complete with the taste of coal dust and the ache in my back from swinging a pickaxe, even though I'd never been underground in my life. I knew the face of a woman named Sarah who had died in 1987. Remembered loving her with an intensity that made my chest hurt, even though we'd never met. The thing feeding on me was gorging itself on my memories, decades of experiences being consumed in hours. My architectural training, gone. My first kiss, gone. The day I graduated college, the time I broke my arm falling out of that oak tree when I was 10, the smell of my grandmother's kitchen, all of it being devoured by something hungry and ancient and utterly alien. In return, I was being force-fed the stolen memories of its previous victims. I lived through the death of a hunter in 1962, felt his last breath as something dark dragged him into the woods. I experienced the final moments of a young woman who'd gotten lost hiking in 1984, felt her terror as her own memories were stripped away just like mine. The personalities of the dead were fighting for control of my skull. I'd catch myself humming songs I'd never heard, speaking in accents I'd never used, craving foods I'd never tasted. My reflection kept changing. Sometimes I had brown eyes instead of blue. Sometimes my hair looked darker or lighter. My own personality was being crowded out by the ghosts of everyone this thing had consumed before me. I was becoming a walking graveyard, a collection of stolen lives with nothing original left. By the third day, I couldn't remember my own name. The face in the mirror was a complete stranger now, features shifting like clay in the hands of an invisible sculptor. I had the architectural skills of someone who'd never seen a blueprint, mixed with the muscle memory of welding steel beams 40 stories up, plus the gentle touch of a nurse who'd worked in a pediatric ward for 30 years. None of it belonged to me. I was living a dozen different lives simultaneously, feeling love for strangers' children, grief for people I'd never known, pride in accomplishments that weren't mine. The memory thief wasn't done with me yet. I could feel it reaching deeper, dissolving the last tiny fragments of who Marcus had been. My original consciousness was like a candle flame in a hurricane, flickering and nearly gone. The thing was patient and thorough. It had been doing this for a long time, probably decades or centuries, perfecting its feeding technique. It knew exactly how to strip away a human identity layer by layer, saving the richest memories for last. My love for my ex-girlfriend Amy, the pride I'd felt when my first building was completed, the terror of almost drowning when I was 7, all of it flowing into the creature's belly like the finest wine. What scared me most wasn't losing my memories. It was gaining new ones that felt completely real. I remembered being Mary Sullivan, dying in these same mountains in 1978 when something dark and hungry found her camping alone. I remembered being Thomas Chen, a surveyor who disappeared in 1995, feeling this same parasitic presence attach itself to his mind. I was carrying the final moments of dozens of people, all of whom had been consumed by this thing that lived in the mountains and fed on human consciousness. We were all still here in a way, trapped inside its collective mind like books in a library that never closed. The creature was preparing to fully absorb me now, to add my consciousness to its collection permanently. I could feel myself being pulled deeper into its mental web, becoming part of its memory bank rather than a separate being. Soon Marcus would be another voice in the chorus of the consumed, another set of experiences for the thing to draw from when it hunted its next victim. My architectural knowledge would become bait for the next creative professional who wandered into these mountains. My memories of Charlotte would help it seem more human, more trustworthy to future prey. But there was still a tiny spark of the original me left, buried deep under all the stolen memories and foreign personalities, some primal survival instinct that refused to be digested. While the creature was distracted, drunk on the richness of my identity, I managed to stumble to my car. My hands shook so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition, and I wasn't even sure I remembered how to drive. The stolen memories were overwhelming. Part of me wanted to go to a house in Tennessee where a dead woman's children were waiting for her to come home from a hiking trip that had ended 20 years ago. I drove down that mountain road like the devil was chasing me, which maybe he was. The thing's influence weakened the further I got from its territory, and slowly, painfully, some of my original memories began to trickle back. Not all of them. I still can't remember my middle name, and my childhood is mostly blank, but enough to know who I was supposed to be. By the time I hit the interstate, I could think clearly again, though I was still carrying fragments of dozens of other people's lives like shrapnel in my brain. I never went back for my drafting equipment or my clothes. To this day, I can't look at architectural plans without getting nauseous. I switched careers entirely. I'm a park ranger now, working in Tennessee, where the mountains feel safer somehow. I still remember things that never happened to me, love people I never met, and sometimes I wake up speaking in voices that aren't mine. The memory thief is still up there, I'm sure of it, patient and hungry, waiting for the next dreamer who thinks they can find inspiration in the isolation of the Blue Ridge Mountains. I hope they're stronger than I was, but I doubt it. That thing has had a lot of practice, and it's very, very good at what it does. I'm 26 years old, and up until last year, I thought I knew what being emotionally drained meant. I work as a social worker down in Charlotte, or at least I used to work there full-time. After what happened at that cabin in the North Carolina mountains, I can barely handle a half-day schedule anymore. See, I'd always been the type of person who felt everything too deeply. Every client's pain, every family's struggle, every kid who got pulled from their home. My supervisor used to say I had too much empathy for this job, but I thought that was what made me good at it. Then Marcus killed himself. Marcus was this 16-year-old kid I'd been working with for almost 2 years. Smart as hell, funny when he wanted to be, but carrying around more trauma than most adults I knew. His dad had been beating him and his mom since he was little, and we'd finally gotten them both out of that situation. I thought we were making real progress. I thought I was helping him heal. Then one Tuesday morning, his mom called me crying so hard she could barely speak. He'd hung himself in his bedroom the night before, left a note saying he was tired of being broken. I completely fell apart, couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't stop thinking about every conversation we'd had, every session where maybe I'd said the wrong thing or missed some sign. My friends at work kept telling me it wasn't my fault, but I knew better. That's what we're supposed to do, help people, save them. And I'd failed in the worst possible way. My friend Janet's family owns this cabin up near Boone, maybe 20 minutes outside of town on some old logging road. When she saw how wrecked I was, she offered to let me stay there for a week or two just to get my head straight. No phone service, no internet, just woods and quiet and space to think. Her family had been going there for years, she said. Real peaceful place. Good for them, bar healing. I should have known better than to go anywhere to heal when I was already that broken. The cabin itself was actually really nice, not some rundown shack like you might expect. Janet's dad had fixed it up real good over the years. Full kitchen, hot water, even a decent TV with a DVD player. Sat right on the edge of this little valley surrounded by old-growth pines and oak trees. First day I got there, I just sat on the back porch with a cup of coffee and listened to the birds. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could actually breathe. That lasted about 2 days. It started small, like these things always do. I'd be sitting there reading or watching a movie, feeling almost normal for a few minutes, and then this wave of sadness would just crash over me. Not the grief I'd been carrying around since Marcus died. This was different, heavier somehow, like someone had poured liquid misery directly into my chest. I'd start crying for no reason at all, just sobbing until I couldn't breathe. At first, I figured it was just delayed shock or whatever. Grief hits people in weird ways, right? But then I started noticing that the sadness felt foreign, like it wasn't coming from inside me, but from somewhere else, somewhere outside. And when I'd try to think about happy memories, my college graduation, my first apartment, even just funny moments with friends, they all felt hollow, empty, like someone had sucked all the joy right out of them. The guilt got worse too, way worse. I'd wake up in the middle of the night with my heart pounding thinking about Marcus, but not just the normal grief thoughts. These were obsessive, circular thoughts that felt like they were being fed into my brain on repeat. You failed him. You were supposed to save him. Everything you touch dies. You're useless. You make everything worse. By day 4, I couldn't even remember what it had felt like to care about anything. I'd look at photos on my phone, pictures of my family, my friends, even my cat back home, and feel absolutely nothing. It was like someone had reached inside my chest and just turned off that part of me that was capable of love. That's when I started to understand that something was wrong with the place itself. I'd be sitting in the living room and suddenly feel this overwhelming empathy for people I didn't even know. I'd start crying about strangers' problems that I was somehow experiencing, as if they were my own. A homeless man in Seattle I'd never met, a mother in Detroit whose daughter had cancer, a farmer in Iowa losing his land. All of their pain flooding through me at once, so intense I'd have to lie down on the floor and wait for it to pass. The thing is, I've always been empathetic. That's why I became a social worker in the first place. But this wasn't natural empathy. This felt like emotional vampirism. Like something was force-feeding me other people's suffering and then draining away my ability to process it or help. I started having these episodes where I'd feel incredibly happy for about 10 minutes, genuinely euphoric, like I'd just won the lottery or fallen in love. Then it would vanish completely, leaving me more empty than before. It reminded me of withdrawal, actually, like I was an addict getting teased with a hit and then having it yanked away. On day 6, I woke up feeling absolutely nothing at all. Not sad, not happy, not worried, just hollow. I spent the entire morning trying to force myself to feel something, anything. I called my mom, and when she told me about my nephew's first steps, I felt nothing. I looked at pictures of Marcus and felt nothing. I even tried watching videos of puppies on my phone, and still nothing. It was like someone had performed surgery on my soul and removed the parts that made me human. That night, lying in bed, I finally understood what was happening to me. Something was feeding on my emotions. Not just the bad ones, all of them. It had been amplifying my guilt and sadness to make them stronger, like fattening up livestock before slaughter. And now that it had consumed everything I had to give, I was just empty. I could feel it around me in the dark. Not see it exactly, but sense its presence. Satisfied, patient, like it was waiting to see what I'd do next, now that I was completely hollowed out. The worst part wasn't even the emptiness, though. The worst part was that I didn't care about being empty. I couldn't care. The thing that should have terrified me, losing my ability to feel love or compassion, didn't register as a problem anymore because I no longer had the emotional capacity to understand why it mattered. I stayed like that for 3 more days, going through the motions of being alive but feeling nothing about any of it. Eating food that tasted like cardboard, watching the sunset and seeing just colors with no beauty. Thinking about my job, my friends, my life back home, and feeling the same blank indifference I'd feel about the weather. On the morning of day 10, I woke up and realized I needed to leave immediately or I was going to die there. Not physically, something much worse. I was going to become something that looked like me but wasn't human anymore. Just a shell walking around, going through the motions of caring about people without actually feeling anything. I packed my stuff in about 20 minutes and got in my car. The strangest thing was driving back down the mountain. As soon as I got maybe 5 miles away from the cabin, I started crying, really crying, for the first time since that first day. All the emotions came flooding back at once like someone had turned the faucet back on. But here's the thing that still scares me. They didn't all come back. I went back to work a few weeks later and I can still do my job. I can still help people, still advocate for families, still fight the system when I need to. But that deep, instinctive empathy I used to have, the thing that made me feel my client's pain as if it were my own, that's gone, permanently. It's like that thing in the mountains didn't just feed on my emotions. It ate the part of me that generated them. I can recognize when someone's hurting now, and I can take the right steps to help them, but I don't feel it anymore. Not the way I used to. I guess in some ways, it's made me better at my job. More objective, less likely to burn out. My supervisor says I seem more balanced now, more professional. But sometimes I catch myself going through the motions of caring, and I wonder if my clients can tell the difference. If they can sense that the person sitting across from them is just pretending to understand their pain. I never told Janet what happened at her family's cabin. How do you explain something like that? But I did some research afterward, looked into the history of that area. Turns out there used to be a state mental hospital about 10 miles from where the cabin sits. Got shut down in the 1970s after some scandals about patient treatment. Before that, it was a tuberculosis sanatorium. Lots of suffering in those mountains over the years. Lots of people who died feeling abandoned and alone. I think something up there got used to feeding on human misery. And when the hospitals closed, it had to find other sources. I still work with kids like Marcus. I still try to help families in crisis. But that cabin taught me something about the limits of empathy. How something that should be a gift can become a vulnerability. How the very thing that makes you want to help people can be turned against you by something that doesn't understand the difference between genuine care and emotional consumption. These days, I'm more careful about how much of myself I give away, not just because of burnout, but because I know now that there are things out there that will take everything you have to offer and leave nothing behind. Things that see human compassion as just another resource, as to be harvested. I drive past the turnoff to that logging road sometimes when I'm heading up to other parts of the mountains, and I swear I can still feel it up there, waiting patiently for the next person who cares too much about other people's pain. The next person who thinks their empathy makes them strong instead of recognizing it as the perfect bait for something that feeds on human souls. I never did figure out how to properly mourn Marcus. That thing took that from me too. But maybe that's okay. Maybe some grief is too dangerous to feel completely. Maybe some kinds of caring will destroy you if you're not careful about where and how you let them grow. I still help people. I'm still good at my job. But I do it now with the knowledge that genuine human emotion is a finite resource, and there are things in this world that will drain every drop if you let them. The trick is learning to help people without bleeding yourself empty in the process. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed at that cabin longer. If I'd let that thing finish whatever it was doing to me. Would I have become something like it eventually? Just another predator feeding on the emotions of people who care too much? I guess I'll never know. But I'm grateful I got out when I did, even if I didn't get out completely unchanged. Because the alternative, becoming something that preys on human compassion instead of feeling it, that's a kind of horror I wouldn't wish on anyone, even if it would have made the pain of losing Marcus finally go away. I'm 24 and I used to be a musician. Well, I thought I was one anyway. My name's Melody, which my parents probably thought was clever when they named me, but it felt like some kind of cruel joke after what happened in Nashville. You know how some people have those videos that go viral for all the wrong reasons? Yeah, that was me. 3.5 million views of me completely bombing at an open mic night, voice cracking on every note, forgetting lyrics I'd written myself. The comments were brutal. I couldn't even look at my guitar for months without wanting to throw up. So when my great-aunt Ruth had to move into assisted care and my family needed someone to check on her old cabin up in the Virginia mountains, I jumped at the chance. Anything to get away from Nashville, from music, from the constant reminder of how badly I'd failed at the one thing I'd always thought I was meant to do. The cabin was this 1940s place that some jazz composer built as a retreat, still had an old upright piano and everything. My aunt said he'd written some of his best work up there, back when the mountains were quieter. The drive up was beautiful in that way that makes you feel small. Winding roads through forests that seem to go on forever. The kind of place where your cell phone loses signal and you remember what actual silence sounds like. I'd packed light. Just some clothes, food for a week, and my guitar, though I wasn't sure why I'd brought it. Couldn't play worth a damn anymore anyway. The cabin sat in this little clearing, maybe half a mile off the main road, connected by a gravel drive that probably hadn't been maintained in years. It was exactly what you'd picture when someone says, mountain retreat. Log walls, stone chimney, big windows looking out into the woods. Inside was like stepping back in time. The composer guy had left behind sheet music scattered on the piano, old, recording equipment, even some instruments hanging on the walls. Everything covered in decades of dust, but somehow still alive, you know? I spent the first couple days just cleaning and settling in. The silence was incredible after months of hiding from the internet. No notifications, no comments, no reminders of my failure. Just wind in the trees and the occasional bird. I started to think maybe this was exactly what I needed. Time away from everything. Space to figure out who I was, if I wasn't a musician. That's when the music started. The first night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to what sounded like someone playing piano downstairs. Not the clunky, out-of-tune upright in the living room. This was rich, full, like a concert grand. Beautiful melody I'd never heard before, something that made my chest ache with how perfect it was. I lay there listening, trying to place the composer. Wasn't Chopin, wasn't Debussy. Definitely wasn't anything the jazz guy would have written. I crept downstairs to investigate. The music stopped the second my foot hit the bottom step. The piano bench was still tucked under the keyboard, no sheet music out, everything exactly how I'd left it. I pressed a few keys. Same old out-of-tune mess it had been that afternoon. The next morning I convinced myself I'd been dreaming. Stress can do weird things to your brain, right? But that night, it happened again. Same beautiful melody, same impossible sound quality. This time I tried to record it on my phone, but when I played it back, there was nothing but silence. By the third night, I was ready. Sat on the couch with a clear view of the piano and waited. Sure enough, around 2 a.m. it started, but this time I could see the keys moving. By themselves. No ghost fingers or anything dramatic like that, just the keys depressing in perfect rhythm, playing music that shouldn't exist. I should have been terrified. Instead, I found myself humming along. The melody was hauntingly familiar, like something I'd written in a dream and forgotten. When it stopped, I walked over to the piano and tried to play it. Back. My fingers found the keys like they knew the way, and for the first time in months, music poured out of me. Not the broken, hesitant playing I'd become used to. This was confident, skilled, beautiful. That's when things got weird. I started waking up with new songs in my head, complete with lyrics, melodies, even harmonies I'd never been able to hear before. I'd grab my guitar and they'd flow out perfectly, like I was channeling something instead of creating. My voice, which had been weak and unreliable since Nashville, suddenly had power, range, control I'd never possessed. Within a week, I'd written more music than in the previous year combined, and it was good, really good. The kind of stuff I'd always dreamed of creating but never had the talent for. I started recording myself, just rough demos on my phone. Posted a few online without much thought. They went viral overnight. Not the bad kind this time. People were calling me a genius, comparing me to artists I'd worshipped my whole life. Record labels started reaching out. Everything I'd ever wanted was suddenly happening. But something felt wrong. The music didn't feel like mine. When I played those songs, it was like watching someone else's hands, hearing someone else's voice. I'd catch myself singing melodies I didn't remember writing, my fingers finding chord progressions I'd never learned. And the lyrics. They were about experiences I'd never had, emotions I'd never felt, stories that weren't mine. One morning I woke up and couldn't remember learning to play guitar. I could still play, better than ever actually. But I had no memory of those early years of practice, the calluses building up, the frustration of learning bar chords. It was like someone had reached into my brain and deleted the struggle, leaving only the skill. That's when I started paying attention to the piano music, really listening. The melodies weren't random. They were pieces of songs I'd loved as a kid, fragments of lullabies my mom used to sing, bits of tunes I'd hummed while learning guitar. But twisted, improved, made perfect. Like something was going through my musical memories and fixing them, making them what they should have been. I found sheet music one morning, written in my handwriting, for songs I'd never composed. My signature at the bottom, dated from years before I'd even come to the cabin. When I played them, they were masterpieces, complex, emotional, technically brilliant, everything I'd ever wanted to create. But they weren't mine. I tried to write something original, something that came from me instead of whatever was feeding me these songs. Nothing came. It was like my actual creative voice had been surgically removed, replaced with this artificial perfection. I could play and sing beautifully, but only the music that appeared in my head each morning, only the songs written in my sleep. The record deal came through. They wanted to fly me back to Nashville, start recording an album. The producer said my demos were the most original music he'd heard in years. Original. That word stuck in my throat. I signed the contract in a daze. The money was more than I'd dreamed of. The validation was everything I'd craved after my public humiliation. But when I looked in the mirror, I didn't recognize the person staring back. She looked like me, sounded like me, but her eyes held knowledge I'd never earned, skill I'd never developed, success I'd never truly achieved. The night before I was supposed to leave for Nashville, I sat at the piano and tried one more time to play something that was authentically mine. Something simple, imperfect, real. My fingers wouldn't cooperate. They kept finding those same perfect melodies, playing songs that felt like wearing someone else's clothes. That's when I heard it, my own voice, singing from upstairs. Not the polished, powerful voice I'd developed over the past month, but my original voice. Weak, uncertain, human. It was singing one of my old songs. One I'd written before Nashville, before the failure, before I came to the mountains. A simple, flawed, honest song about feeling lost. I followed the sound upstairs. The singing was coming from the bedroom, but when I opened the door, it was empty. Just my suitcase packed for Nashville and my old guitar case in the corner, the one I hadn't touched since arriving. I opened the case. Inside was a letter in my handwriting. You gave me your failure and I gave you my success. The exchange is complete. You are everything you wanted to be. I am everything you were. Fair trade. There was no signature, but at the bottom of the letter was a small sketch, a figure sitting at a piano, but the proportions were all wrong. Too many fingers, joints bending the wrong way, face that was almost human, but not quite. I understood then. Something in this place had been feeding on my musical identity, my authentic creative voice, replacing it with artificial perfection. I'd traded my real self for manufactured talent, my honest struggle for hollow success. I could go to Nashville, make my album, be famous, live the dream I'd always wanted. But it wouldn't be my dream. It would be wearing my life like a costume while I became something else entirely, something hungry and patient, waiting in an old cabin for the next failed musician to find their way up the mountain. I burned the contract that night and drove straight home. Didn't pack, didn't clean up, didn't even lock the door behind me. Just ran. I never made music again. Couldn't even listen to it without feeling sick. Got a job at a hardware store, found a little apartment in town, learned to be okay with ordinary. Sometimes I catch myself humming those perfect melodies from the mountains, and I have to stop myself before they take hold again. The songs I wrote up there did make it to Nashville somehow. They're playing on the radio now, performed by some new artist nobody's ever heard of. She has my face in the music videos, but her eyes are wrong. Too knowing, too hungry. She plays piano with fingers that bend just slightly the wrong way. I don't talk about this much. People wouldn't believe me anyway. They'd say I had a breakdown, that success scared me, that I sabotaged myself when everything was finally going right. Maybe they're not wrong. Maybe I did choose failure over success, authenticity over perfection. But sometimes, late at night when I'm alone in my apartment, I'll pick up my old guitar and play something simple and imperfect and completely my own. It sounds terrible compared to what I could do up there. Off-key, clunky, human. It's the most beautiful music I've ever made.